Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Byrne, and I'm the Executive Director of Freep Film Festival. and I'm here to welcome you to this discussion about the film Who Killed Vincent Chin. Just to get out of the way right from the outset, we want to offer up an apology. We know some of the people that attempted to access the movie at 7:30, which was our published start time, were not able to do so. That was due to a technical issue on our end, not anyone else's end. So we're working on getting that fixed. The positive news is that the film is going to be available for 72 hours once it's up. As soon as it is, we're going to send out an email to all ticket holders so you'll know that it's there. If you're here right now, I'm assuming you are watching this conversation live. If you prefer to watch the movie first and then see the conversation afterwards, it is going to be connected to the film with a one-button push, and this conversation will also remain up at the Free Press's YouTube channel. So I encourage you to enjoy this conversation. I know what's lined up is going to be excellent. And again, I will apologize on our part that that initial launch of the film did not go as we hoped or expected, but it is going to be available there for you to see. All right, this whole evening is being presented by Freep Film Festival, Cinema Detroit, and Over the Moon Detroit. I'm here just for a minute to give you a second about what Freep Film Festival is about. It is the documentary-focused festival produced by the Detroit Free Press. We're now in our 8th year. We especially like to focus and play up films that have strong connections to Detroit and Michigan, which is why we were super happy to be attached to the Academy Award nominated Who Killed Vincent Chin. Our next festival weekend is scheduled for September 22 to 26th, and I hope that we see you there. We expect to be doing some physical screenings. We'll also be doing virtual screenings, and we'll be doing some stuff in the interim too. Watch out for our monthly events. So it's time for me to get out of here, and I'm going to hand it off to Paula from Cinema Detroit. She is going to be your host and moderator tonight, and she's going to be bringing in all our guests. I know the last thing I'll say, I got a chance to meet everybody a few hours ago. This is a group of super smart people that have some very interesting things to say, both about the film and, you know, the current state that we're all living in. So I'm going to take off and hand it off to you, Paula. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm Paula Guffett. I'm the co-founder and programmer at Cinema Detroit, an independent nonprofit art house cinema in Greater Downtown. And welcome again to our screening and discussion of Who Killed Vincent Chin. Ordinarily, this discussion and screening would have taken place at Cinema Detroit, but that wasn't possible. So I want to thank Freep Film Festival and Over the Moon Detroit for presenting this event with us. As you might have guessed, Cinema Detroit is physically still closed except for private events, and I'm still programming films on Virtual Cinema Detroit and our streaming platform, Cinema Detroit Marquee, where you can still enjoy films and support us at the same time. And info on both of those and a bunch of other stuff is at cinemadetroit.org, which contains all things Cinema Detroit. I wanted to revisit this film, Who Killed Vincent Chin, due to the parallel I've been seeing between 1982 and 2020 into 2021, which is a climate of hostility toward Asian Americans, from rhetoric to physical attacks to the minimization of racism. Back then, in the 80s, it was due to the auto industry implosion, which was blamed on imported cars. Currently, it is COVID-19. Then there was this shooting in Atlanta on March 16th, which really reinforce this idea that this film is sadly still relevant. So I want to bring in now our panel. Juanita. Hi.
Hi, Paula. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay, and next, Paula Y.
Hi, it's Paula Yu. Thank you very much for having me here. And I guess I'm supposed to introduce myself?
Yes.
I just realized, actually, Juanita, please, you go first.
Yeah, sorry.
I forgot we were supposed to do that.
I'm sorry.
I'm Juanita Anderson. I was born and raised in Detroit, and I was the executive producer of Who Killed Vincent Chin.
Okay. And I'm Paula Yu, and I am the author of the book, Let me go here. From a whisper to a rallying cry, the killing of Vincent Chin and the trial that galvanized the Asian American movement. It was just published yesterday by Norton Young Readers, which is an imprint of W.W. Norton and Company. And I credit Juanita and Renee and Christine for this incredible Academy Award nominated documentary that changed my life in college and in my early 20s, and has proven to be just an incredible piece of art and newsworthy documentary making. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for being here, Scott. Can we bring Scott in? Hi, Scott.
Hello. Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Scott Kurashige, professor and chair in the Department of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies at Texas Christian University, author of several books, including Detroit-related titles, The Next American Revolution, co-authored with Grace Lee Boggs, and my latest book was The 50-Year Rebellion, How the U.S. Political Crisis Began in Detroit.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Jasmine?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
My name is Jasmine Rivera. I am a filmmaker, and I'm also the communications director for Rising Voices of Asian American Families, which is an organization that is dedicated to fostering civic engagement and intersectional organizing for Asian American women and families in the state of Michigan. So thank you so much for including me.
Thank you for being here. And Esther?
Hi, everyone. My name is Esther Kim, and I'm with Over the Moon Detroit. I'm one of the founding members of the organization, which is a collective of creatives and activists, which our goal is to not only share our culture, but also highlight and showcase Asian movers and shakers in the city. One of our mottos is be seen, be celebrated, because if we don't do it ourselves, who else is going to? And also we support movements that really elevate Asian issues, especially right now, where we see that it's needed more than ever.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So my first question is for Juanita. We had talked a little bit about this before the show started. What was the impetus for you all to make Who Killed Vincent Chin?
Well, first of all, let me just take a moment to acknowledge and honor the vision and perseverance of filmmakers Renee Tajima and Christine Choi, who produced and directed this film respectively. For me, I had just moved back to Detroit in early 1982, just a few months before Vincent Chin was killed. And as I began to watch the news stories unfold, and especially after Judge Kaufman's sentencing of $3,000 and probation to Vincent Chin's killers, the news media really galvanized and began to investigate this story. And at the same time, we began to see movement by the American Citizens for Justice and really rallying and protesting the sentencing. But what I realized was that notwithstanding the extensive and intensive coverage by Detroit news media, that we were not hearing the vantage point of Asian Americans, except for in press clips from press conferences or very brief sound bites. So I began to think, especially as the Department of Justice came in, this is really a national story that deserves to be told by Asian American filmmakers, and include and give voice to Asian Americans who are deeply involved in this project. So I contacted Christine Choi, whose work I was familiar with, asked if she would be interested in working on the film. And she said yes, but she also told me that Renee Tajima was in California at that particular moment because her brother had been killed in an act of anti-Asian violence, and she had begun documenting Mrs. Chin as she was traveling across the country. So it was the coming together of the three of us really working to develop this film together.
that response sort of brings to mind something else we were sort of talking about, and that is visibility and the lack thereof. And so that's kind of a thread that I see like running through all of this. And I know, Esther, when we had talked, you said that Vincent Chin, like you are born like much later than that event. And it was...
I think
Go
to
ahead.
put it a little bit more, my idea more clearly, Vincent Chin didn't have that kind of relevance as maybe some of the civil rights history that we learn in school. And as we touched on before, there are parts of Asian history that is not told or shared, and you get it through secondhand knowledge. So it could have been just a crime of a random Asian person not understanding behind the story that it was actually a hate crime during the recession, and people were blaming the Japanese auto industry because we live in the auto industry state.
Zero.
Right. And so they put a face to the recession, which was an Asian face. It didn't matter that the person wasn't Japanese. It's just an Asian face, which we're seeing right now is that it doesn't matter whether you're Korean or Chinese or Hmong or anything. They're assigning that otherness to a certain situation or crisis that's happening. So we never got that story when we were growing up, and that's not taught to us. So like moving forward, this is all like new knowledge unless somebody digs it themselves. And when I was doing Over the Moon, as I was saying, we some people knew about it, but we didn't know exactly the whole detail. Like we would know certain like history of like George Washington and every other president, but we never knew that the part of this history. And especially in Michigan, you know, I'm surprised that we don't give it the same kind of you know, gravity as some of the other people that we celebrate as well. And that just tells you like that we live in like Asians have two different Americas for Asian Americans. One is, as you were touching upon, we're invisible, and then the other one, we're marginalized. And it all goes against that model minority theory that we're all successful. We all, you know, we're doing great. We have no issues. We have no problems. And that's what we as young generation deal with. Because the reason why we say be seen, be celebrated is because you rarely see, you know, when Detroit was just starting to come up with New Detroit and everything, there was a lot of new Asian businesses that were popping up. There was Asian creatives doing work. You never saw them celebrate, but you saw like white businesses that took on sort of like this fusion Asian restaurants. They were raised up, but none of the Asians, you know, and that's the reason why we did Over the Moon, because people didn't know. And I even, as I shared before, when I would go to Detroit, like outside of downtown, people would think I was lost, and they would go, I think you're in the wrong place. I've never seen you before. I've never seen your kind before. So this just tells you, and that was the one main question when we had the event. We said, where did the Asians go? Because there was once a thriving Asian population, but in the city, you rarely know where they are, who they are, and that goes with the history, like just how scattered we are. And I don't include suburbs really, because I feel like we were pushed to the suburbs. Yeah.
So and Paula, with your book, you're kind of wanting to change that. Like, I understand that the effort is to get this information. The book is for all ages, so it'll be taught in schools eventually, like to get more of that information out there.
Yeah, because you know, right now, one of the statistics that came out recently was that 1 out of 4 AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islander teenagers, have reported being victims of physical and or verbal harassment and bullying in direct response to the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And that angers me because had Asian American history, AAPI history, been taught this whole time, maybe this hatred wouldn't have existed, or this ignorance wouldn't have existed, and we would be humanized instead of dehumanized as the model minority myth, where our individual achievements and talents and hard work are reduced to a monolith and our individuality is trivialized and dehumanized. And I would say that I wrote this book just like the documentary. I don't hold back. It's not sanitized. It's not censored. I very much hit into the hard, gritty truth of it all. But we aimed it towards the young adult market because, first of all, teens are really savvy. They're very, very smart. And they've always been throughout history. I was a smart teen. You all were smart teens. We're curious. And so I think that they're ready to handle this type of information. And just on a personal note, I get angry hearing about Esther saying, I'm the only one in the town. People think I'm lost, or I never heard this growing up, because I'm a Gen Xer. I'm from the Reality Bites generation. And I was 25 when I wrote for the Detroit News in 1994. And you flip the numbers around, I just turned 52. And I did not think all these years later, I would be, hearing this from a lovely young person saying the same thing. When I was your age, I would desperately go out of this hunger and thirst to learn about Asian American history and contributions in this country. I would go to that tiny little Asian bookshelf at your local bookstore at the Barnes & Noble, just reading whatever I could. I'm self-taught, and that shouldn't be the case. And I think that one of the more encouraging signs is because of Atlanta, because of the coronavirus, the state of Illinois is one of the first places to start saying, okay, we got to change this. We're putting in resolutions. We're putting in mandates to have Asian American history be taught more in depth in our education system. So to me, as with what's happening, the changes hopefully that are happening with our justice system, the same can be done for the education system.
I hope so. Yeah. And then sort of another myth that we were talking about is specifically Scott brought up that the Vincent Chin case is not an isolated incident. Do you want to talk about that some?
Yeah, I think there's a history of anti-Asian violence as a concept, right? And I think the Vincent Chin movement and other tragic incidents in the 80s really helped create a naming of this phenomenon of anti-Asian. But violence against Asians in the US and violence by Americans on Asians in Asia, of course, goes way back. I mean, most of the wars in the 20th century that the US was involved in, the most deadly wars involved Asians as the enemy targets: Philippines, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and then into the so-called war on terror, right? And it's not just that these were wars; it's that the Asian enemies were dehumanized with racist terminology like gooks. That it was deemed that even the Asian allies looked like the enemies, right? And so you have these massacres at No Gun Ri during the Vietnam War, or at My Lai during the Vietnam War, and dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are unprecedented events. Only the US has used nuclear weapons in this way to annihilate hundreds, thousands of civilians, right, in one step like that. So there's a notion that Asian lives are cheap that comes from, right, notions of US militarism and imperialism. This type of violence is oftentimes intersects with misogyny and gendered forms of racism. And it also intersects with the idea that Asians are also cheap, disposable workers, right? That we were used to build railroads and to plow fields, but when our labor was no longer needed, we were subjected to exclusion laws, right? And discriminatory housing and education practices. And this type of notion that we are both, cheap laborers is paired with these more recent ideas that Asians are now an economic threat at the top, right? With the Japanese auto companies in the 80s, or with China in technology, so on. And of course, more recently, we've seen this idea that Asians are a public health threat during the coronavirus, but this goes way back. Chinese exclusion, practices were rooted in the idea that Chinatown posed a particular health threat. So I think there's a lot of intersecting connections here that we need to be mindful of. And I think when we look at the Vincent Chin case, we can see a lot of things come together. Transnational issues, gendered issues. Of course, this incident starts in a strip club, but it also starts in a city that's where Asians are really sometimes caught in between segregation between white and black racial divides that are so deeply entrenched, of course, in Detroit and clearly predate the 1967 rebellion. So I just think there's a lot more we can talk about here, and thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. And then Jasmine, with your work with Rising Voices, I know that you get into some of the intersectional stuff. Obviously, you said that what you're working on, deals with the intersection of race, gender, etc. So can you talk a little bit about, does the Vincent Chin case come into your work? And probably some of the interactions that you have with Black Lives Matter and things like that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the Vincent Chin case is something our organization right now is working in tandem with a few researchers to bring to light the complicity of the UAW in fostering anti-Asian sort of sentiment. I mean, it's there in the documentary. You can see it where were they were sponsoring, here's hit a car, and all of the anti-Japanese propaganda was put up across the street from where everyone can see. And so that sort of research that we're doing and bringing to light is very important to us. But also we want to kind of draw a line from that history to what's happening now. And definitely the coronavirus scapegoating is something that we definitely addressed. We work for civic engagement, voter participation, political education, things like that. And it's really interesting that this past year, when we surveyed the Michigan Asian American community, our findings said that we had an amazing rise in voter participation that was motivated primarily by race and the coronavirus. And so you had about a 93% rise in voter turnout in the state of Michigan because of the scapegoating that was taking place. So while we're talking about the victimization of people from violence, racial violence, there's also that story that needs to be told of the movements that take place behind it, the history of those movements, and also what's happening now in terms of people standing up, raising their voices, demanding visibility, and then also moving the course of the entire nation when people actually participate.
Because
sorry. And
no.
Lives Matter, to answer your question, all the work that we do, it is very important for us to continually assert that we do need to address the issues of anti-Blackness within the Asian American community, which are definitely there and have been, it's part of the larger problem of white supremacy and how that has been internalized around the world and taught to people. At the same time, we know that whatever movements we have, whatever organizations, nothing is going to move forward without solidarity. So the Black civil rights movement has been the pioneer for everything in the United States in terms of activism, and so we follow in those footsteps respectfully, and also understand that nothing that we can do is ever going to matter if we don't address white supremacy together as a whole.
I agree. Yeah, totally. So the other thing that we kind of touched on before was the fact that the Asian American movement didn't just start with Vincent Chin. It certainly was like a rallying cry, as Paula's book says, but that there had been, other instances or movements previous to that, and often like in concert with like the Black Panthers and things like that. And someone wrote that Sarah D said that she wishes that something like Paula Wai's book had been available at her school when she was younger. She did not encounter any Asian American themed books until college. So that's good.
Thank
I mean,
you.
was that the case with everyone here? I mean, was that pretty much the case? Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I have to say that, I grew up in the 80s. I felt the reverberation of the Vincent Chin incident. And just watching the documentary again tonight, I watched it on my own streaming. it was very eerie and very visceral in terms of experiencing Detroit in the 80s as a kid. And had I had something like Paula's book to guide me and to give me consolation in terms of not being alone, then that would have made a huge difference, I think, in my trajectory growing up.
Thank you. I do want to bring up something interesting, just marrying what we've all been talking about. Thank you again. When I interviewed Morris Cotton, he was a 24-year-old rookie cop who was one of the people at the scene at the McDonald's, who basically was one of the people that arrested Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz. And what happened was, when I interviewed him, I mean, his story, he should be the next book. He is just an incredible role model, and he has such an incredible life, and he's a great storyteller. And he brought up that when he was at the station and he had to fill out the police report, he told me there were only 2 boxes for the race for Vincent, white and black. And he said, I had no choice but to do white, and it bothered him. And he told the commanding officer at the time, he said, why are you letting these guys go? I lock up people for marijuana. You're kidding me. And so he knew something was off that very night. And to this day, he's an ally and he's a friend, of our community, as we are to him and his community. And I think that he's another example. I mean, within the book, he's another example of, it's not just Asian American activists and just regular people trying to make a difference. It's also about the solidarity, the bonds that were forming between the churches, the synagogues, the Black community, the Asian American community in Detroit. It was a huge debt of gratitude to Horace Sheffield and a lot of the other Black activist leaders in Detroit in the 80s. And you have Congressman Conyers, you have Jesse Jackson. So I think that, Jasmine was talking about white supremacy and the images. There are certain images that get curated in the media. How come I don't see those images all the time? Yes, negativity, prejudice exists for everybody. I mean, I understand people are unfortunately people. But by curating those images and not showing this other side does incredible damage. And that's why we have things like Atlanta and Indianapolis, Boulder, and the list goes on, and George Floyd, the list goes on.
Yeah, I think there's a real kind of parallel between the Vincent Chin case and the George Floyd case. And that is that, I mean, the sentence in the Vincent Chin case, obviously ridiculous. And we don't have sentencing, with George Floyd. We do have a guilty verdict, which is great, but it's not enough. It's, there's a lot more work to be done, obviously.
And Paula, could I just interject for a moment?
Sure.
Because yesterday, when the verdict was announced, I could really only take half a breath because I realized that, we're 8 weeks away from sentencing. And in the back of my mind is what happened in terms of sentencing with Vincent Chin. I also know that there's a process of appeals that will probably take place. And even though Ebens was convicted in the original civil rights trial, and this was the first civil rights trial involving Asian Americans, on the appeals case, he was acquitted. So justice has yet to be served in the case of Mr. Floyd. And it almost brings tears to my eyes in realizing that we still have to hold our breaths longer. But also I think that Vice President Harris said something really powerful yesterday, that this is really just, in terms of the George Floyd case, there's a very big difference, if I can paraphrase her, between an act of justice and equal justice. And we're nowhere near that yet in terms of equal justice.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Absolutely, Scott.
I mean, I think in the George Floyd case, even just following just some of the basics of the defense, it was so clear. This was just another instance in which there was a national gaslighting campaign going on. Maybe it was emissions from a tailpipe. Maybe he had a weak heart. Maybe it was drugs. something else, right? Anything to take away from the systemic problem of white supremacist police violence against African Americans, right? And there's a link there to the history of anti-Asian violence, because even in this extremely prominent case of Vincent Chin, right? Throughout the film, you see Ronald Eben saying over and over again, I'm not a racist. Even his friends saying, well, he might say a racist thing, you know, behind closed doors, but he wouldn't say it in a bar like that. I mean, to somehow think that unless, you know, you have a tape recording of Ronald Eben saying, I'm going to beat you with a baseball bat on your head now because I hate Chinese people, right? Then you can't call it an act of racism, right? I mean, this is the bar that's set. And again, thankfully, so far, you know, that type of gaslighting has failed in the Derek Chauvin trial. But it's so clear that, you know, for me, having gone to junior high and high school in the 80s, I wouldn't have used the term hate crime, because even though I grew up in a very diverse, relatively socially liberal part of, you know, Los Angeles, it was extremely common for people of color to be called racial epithets, you know, to be bullied, and so on. So we just thought that's just the way it is, you know, living in this society, right? And so now to have films like this, and more important, to have movements related to, right, struggles for social justice, particularly those that cut across racial boundaries, I just think is so important. And I hope it's making a difference, you know, in the lives of young people today. And just one more incident I think we need to bring in, because it's almost been forgotten from history. 2006, there was a very, very small story about a Hmong American 18-year-old teenager being shot and killed by the police 27 times in his own home. And this was in response to a domestic call from his family that occurred the night before, right? So talk about, you know, a threat having already dissipated. What necessity was there for the police to go into his house without a warrant and basically, you know, barge right in and shoot him, right? This case would have almost been completely forgotten if we hadn't been working with some young American youth who brought it to the attention of some of us who are activists and organizers. And we work with other folks. We work with the Macomb County NAACP. We work with the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality to raise some more awareness of this. But clearly, some of these cases where the police can say, oh, you know, it was self-defense, he was a gangbanger, it was a dangerous situation, you know, that form of gaslighting occurs, so we don't know the name Chonburi Zhang or that case in the same way we know the Vincent Chin story.
You know, it's interesting too. I think it's important to point out, as I think back to the civil rights trial in 1984 in the Vincent Chin case versus what happened in the appeals court. Ronald Eben testified in 1984 at his civil rights trial. He did not testify in the appeals. And I think that that made a world of difference just in terms of hearing his own voice and his own story versus not hearing it.
That's actually very true. He was actually, and it was in your documentary when they were saying that one juror was saying he was not a reliable witness. He very conveniently forgot certain things. And the testimony that actually really sold it for them was Racine Colwell, the young professional dancer at the club, you know, who was very much full of integrity. As she said, this is exactly what I heard, you know, and I was not coached. And this is, yeah. And I agree with you on that.
So we had a couple of comments come through, and one was a past student of yours, Scott, that said he was grateful that you had them read Helen Zia's book in school. And then someone else said that they had not known about the Vincent Chin case, but finding out about it much later after it happened made them look up other cases. So this is good. So I just wanted you to see that. Wow. Okay. So,
Well, just one thing, just to talk about how the world changes fast. I taught a class in 2002. It was a first-year seminar at the University of Michigan, and one of the issues we focused on, I don't know if the student was in that class or not, was the Vincent Chin case. And the students said, well, this should be on Wikipedia. So they actually looked, and there wasn't even a Wikipedia entry for Vincent Chin at that time. And
Now
obviously
there
it's
is.
a lot since then. I don't know if there's any trace of what other students put on there now. But yeah, they said they were the first ones.
I've seen it. There's actually a couple of good references. I was kind of impressed. There was some primary sourcing, so some good, smart students added. I was actually going to say, too, one thing with this amazing documentary, and just in my own research and doing the case, and I know Scott, he posted this incredible thread that I was like, that's, very much, it was amazing what he did when you broke down the case as well. You do such a great job of doing that. But what was interesting to me doing the research was I thought at first, even before I saw the documentary, oh, this is going to be it's a cut and dried case, right? It's like evil guy, evil racist gets away with murder, and, it's good versus evil. And the more you delve into it, and when you do, there are some nuances, there are some complexities behind the case, behind the whole he said, and also just in terms of what Scott said earlier. I mean, for us, the bar is so high. I have to hit you in front of a camera and actually say the words instead of a euphemism or something that's not specifically racist and Asian oriented. And I actually, at the end of the day, was grateful that I was able to look at the nuances and complexities, because we cannot talk about racism in this country by only talking about people who wear KKK hoods and people who, shoot you because of the color. We need to talk about microaggressions. We need to talk about the more subtle stuff, because that's also a huge part of racism, because a lifetime of microaggressions can lead to a lifetime of trauma as well, and self-doubt and invisibility, as I think Esther or a couple of you pointed out earlier. So that's another thing that I think the Vincent Chin case is so fascinating, because it's not just cut and dried. It's also about the really, really complicated Byzantine subject that is racism.
Just to follow up on that, I keep thinking about the narrowness of the civil rights law. But it does not change the fact that Helen Zia said it so clearly, that Vincent Chin would not be dead if he was not Asian American. I mean, when we take a look at the societal conditions, both nationally and locally at the time, and we have newscasters beating Toyotas, with sledgehammers or whatever, there's this whole climate that has been built up that allowed Asian Americans to be scapegoated, pure and simple. And there's no way that I can play this back with the details that I know, regardless of what was said or not said, that inside the club. That allow me to think that Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz would not have tracked Vincent Chin to a McDonald's.
Yeah.
And one holds him down while the other bashes his head in with a baseball bat, unless he were Asian American.
No, I think that, I definitely agree with that, because I think that back then too, microaggressions, internalized racism, confirmation bias, those terms, those are fancy. That didn't exist back then. And the attitude in America was you can only be racist in the 1980s if you do exactly what Scott says. And I unfortunately think there's a large population today that still believes that and doesn't understand optics matter. Bad jokes, bad timing against the backdrop of the coronavirus, anti-Asian racism, or against the 1980s anti-Asian sentiment because of the car import and auto industry situation. Words matter, and you have to be accountable. You can't just make a joke. That's not. That's cut and dried. I agree with you on that.
Can I add also? It's not just words; it's the constant barrage of imagery as well. I'm an artist, so. You can't forget, even if it's not said, it's the visual. Like, I don't know how, even like in our comics, and I know people are getting an uproar of Dr. Seuss, but even as a child, I didn't realize this like subtle racism that was being instilled in me growing up that, we're now understanding further. And I think that it's not just from like the court system, but it's almost cumulative. Like the media constantly, like even in the way that they desexualize men, Asian men, but then fetishize Asian women. we see the visuals and also the demonizing of China. I mean, everything must be made in America, can't be made in China. That was, I think, still going on back then, and it's still going on now. So if you combine that, that's just like a ticking time bomb, and then now add Corona onto it. And I think it's that kind of like, I'm more caught by imagery, like words, sure. But for me, as a creative, if you see it in advertising, you see it in the media, you see it in books, you see it on your apps, you see it on TikTok, you see it on, it's constant barrage. Like if you go just even on your apps, it's a constant barrage of anti-hate imagery and words. And people are like, oh, it's just a joke. Can't you just take a joke? So, thinking back to, I think it's just, we're now more aware of it. And Vincent Chin's case is just highlighting, it didn't start here. It just went way back that we didn't know, that we're not being taught. And it's unfortunate that even like, if you're not Asian, this should be like a prerequisite. It should be like, you should learn everybody's history, not just, white American history, the Pilgrims. It should be Native Americans. It should be Asians. It should be Black. These are all things that we need to learn because it's all connected, and if we can just say Vincent Chin was just like the most jarring, because like, as I think it was Jasmine who mentioned it, there was like Vincent Chin was considered white. So that to me just blows my mind, because, when you're growing up and you go even to college entry exams, you have to check off, there's only certain like Pacific Islander Asian, but Asians aren't a monolith. You know what I mean? So I used to always do other, because I'm like, I don't fit into a category. But the fact that back then you were considered white just blows my mind. Like, I can't believe it. And we talk about it a lot, even among us as friends, because, there's a difference between East Asians and Southeast Asians. And, you can't just like lump them all into just one little pile. And I think that's what's sad about what we're seeing now, is because it doesn't even matter, because now people are just saying, if you look like this, then we're just going to hate on you because you're just, who cares, And I think that's what we're seeing. The precursor is Vincent Chin, is that they were mad at the Japanese industry, but because he just looked like, any Asian, we're just going to attack him. And how do we, as Asians, like now that we're like fast forward to now, how do we address it? Because the violence isn't stopping. The hate isn't stopping. We just did a recent Stop the Anti-Hate, and it was very like, the community came together, but yet we hear another Asian elder person got attacked, So it's like, how do we as Asians take this lesson here and then move forward to, how do we make the bleeding stop, I guess is what I'm saying. Because it's been happening. I think it's been a slow bleed. And now we're just seeing that, like, it's just like, how much more blood is going to come out.
I think just to kind of step in for a bit, it was interesting watching the film. Again, I'm going to put my filmmaker hat on this time, but watching the interviews with Evans and Nitz and what people were saying, in terms of explaining what happened when there are Asian people at the front door and they ask, why did you do it? Why did you kill him? And he said, well, I was angry. He made me angry. And the fact remains that he took a baseball bat and he hit a man until his brains fell out onto the sidewalk. And so that struck me in that moment, where it's kind of like that, the lack of putting on the brakes only happens when you do not recognize the other person as a human being. It allows you to keep a knee on a man's neck for 9 minutes. It allows you to shoot a little girl in the chest 4 times. There are no brakes because these are not human beings. And so that sort of internalized split-second decisions that people make in that instance of violence is deeply rooted in this constant conditioning that they have from white supremacy as a whole. From the moment that you're born and you're told that there's a hierarchy of human value and that people who are different are at the bottom and you're at the top, this is something that poisons everybody. So when we say about, Asian Americans have to work in solidarity with the Black community and things like that, that is also a wake-up call for white Americans to understand that their community has been, is subject to this same poison. And so in terms of how we fight back, how can we figure out solutions to this problem? We have to make it clear that this is something that affects everyone, drags us down, and leads to children, to your children who will grow up to be adults, to potentially be killers, and continue the cycle of violence. So I think that's something that struck me. It's very eerie watching the documentary, just that moment of, a lack of humanity that leads to death.
I think that's beautifully and powerfully said. And I'll just say very quickly, in my book, one of the things that I saw in the court transcript when he was on the stand, they kept asking him, why did you do it? And he finally just said, something just snapped.
I want to follow up on this point because I remember Renee Tajman once talked about this as a rashaman narrative, right? That there are these different stories being told about the same event. And clearly for Asian Americans, it's a story of the rise of a social movement, consciousness raising, awakening, building coalitions, right? But it's also a story about the white backlash against civil rights in the 1980s, right? I mean, and just like we were saying, these dog whistle terms get used in the post-civil rights era. Nixon with the silent majority and call for law and order. Reagan with his attack on so-called welfare queens, and these moves towards voter suppression, which began during the Reagan Justice Department and now are coming to full fruition as someone like John Roberts, who worked in that Reagan administration, is now Chief Justice. And so, when Ebens, for instance, witness say, okay, let's say he didn't put aside the question of did he say, you MFs, which he says couldn't even be construed as racist. We know that the witnesses he repeatedly called Vincent Chin boy. Now, Ronald Ebens is not a line worker, right? He's a 40-something-year-old man. As a foreman in a factory, there must be lots of African Americans working under him. He knows even the term to call another man boy is a degrading term, particularly when it's about him claiming his space inside the strip club. And so when his defense attorney says Ronald Ebens is a macho man who wouldn't back down for a fight, but that's not a civil rights violation, maybe that works, with this jury, right? Or it didn't work with the first jury at least. But clearly it's about him asserting his masculinity as a white man who's used to being, in power over Black workers, and in this case, over an Asian man. So what snaps is this sense like, wait a minute, this Vincent Chin is supposed to be a silent model minority. Why isn't he not staying in his place? Why is he not respecting my place as a white man, who's supposed to be the dominant figure here, right? So I think there's so many ways in which, it's and for these white men who feel like, there's an interview with Ebens where he says civil rights laws, I think it's actually Michael Moore even for the Free Press.
Yeah.
Civil rights laws, they might be needed, where you have the Klan or those extreme racists in the South, but you don't need civil rights laws in Detroit. And of course, you ask any African American, and it's ludicrous to think that there's no racism or discrimination in Detroit because the whole suburbs were built on white flight and segregation and racial disparities. And L. Brooks Patterson made a whole career going from anti-busing to running on hatred of Detroit and fear of Detroit and stereotypes about Detroit being dangerous and crime-ridden. So, that backlash against civil rights is so apparent in the discourse. It's not just African Americans who have civil rights laws. Now Asians get to claim these civil rights laws too. And clearly there's a path from that to Donald Trump as well.
No, and it's so interesting because when I interviewed some of the activists involved and some just the regular citizens like Mabel Lim, sweet elderly, much older lady, I love her. She told me she was born and raised in Detroit. She's a native Detroiter, and her and her husband would go to rent an apartment. They would go. And then they would see them and say, "Oh, we already found a renter." And she's like, "We just called you 5 minutes ago," because they didn't realize she was trying to. Roland Huang, one of the activists, said that when his family moved to Livonia, neighbors started doing a petition to say, are you okay with a Chinese family moving in, an Oriental family? So, and again, you go back to Atlanta, and he was just having a bad day, and this was not a hate crime. This was a crime of misogyny, and yet we're being denied housing. Exactly as what you say. I mean, it just to hear those anecdotes matched up with your academia, it really, I think, brings alive what this community has gone, what our community has gone through.
Yeah, I just snapped to he had a bad day. It's the same thing. Like it's the same.
These aren't the people you send to these aren't, let the punishment fit the criminal, not the crime.
Right.
I'd like to follow up on something that Scott was talking about in terms of like reactionary backlash. I think about in college how we learned, I remember for one class we had to learn the entire civil rights history timeline, and just mapping out, the timing of the civil rights movement compared to how long it took for slavery to actually take place in the United States and colonialism and things like that. And right now, I mean, and we're going to say it with Donald Trump, is that this is a backlash to, the Obama administration, to the continued rise of a United States that is no longer going to be majority white. And here specifically in Michigan, we see that there is an effort to silence the Asian American community because they know that the votes that were made in November made a difference in pushing Michigan to the other side, and also in Georgia. We now have a new administration because of the turnout. And so right now there are efforts in place where people are trying to pass legislation that will make it extremely hard, specifically Asian American communities in Michigan who rely on voting, mail-in voting, and in-language support and things like that. Those are under attack. And it is targeted, specific, and strategic. And so this is something that people need to realize that, the one step forward, 5 steps back is kind of the pattern that we have here. And to hold the line is what we have to do. And that's just the history of the civil rights movement here in the United States.
We're nearly at the end of our hour. It's been fascinating listening to all of you. So I guess I want to have a sense of where you all think we can go, sort of jumping off from what Jasmine is just talking about, the future with everything, this backlash, coming at everyone. Where do you see the anti-racism movements going? What are we going to have to do to continue and to try to progress?
I think it's really important as we look at particularly issues of voter suppression, but the whole notion of what equal justice means, that we have to get out of our individual silos and work together as Black people, as Latinx people, as Asian American people, as Indigenous people, to really realize that we are all in this together, and this is a battle against us collectively, and that it is one in which I just wrote something several weeks ago. I'm sorry to digress. Well, actually several days ago in one of my social media posts about a cultural climate of white superiority that is intent on persisting. It's been long ingrained in our society, and we have to fight that with everything we have.
And I think, Detroit history is so important to these efforts. When I met Grace Lee Boggs in 1998, keep in mind, most Asian American activists and Asian American studies scholars didn't even know who she was then. And now you see her name being brought up repeatedly in almost every, Asian American statement or demonstration that's taking place. And I think it's because so many people recognize that what Grace and Jimmy Boggs represent is this, it's exactly what Juanita is talking about, this bringing social justice movements together, people from different backgrounds, bring in the synergy and power of those together. And I think we can do that by also looking at the history. You know, there are these amazing scenes in Who Killed Vincent Chin of kind of the last remnants of the Chinatown in the lower caste corridor, right? But that was actually the new Chinatown, because the original Chinatown was destroyed by the Lodge Freeway. And when we look back and see, you know, there were struggles to survive the demolition of Chinatown. At the same time, Black Bottom and Hastings Street were being destroyed, you know, by the Chrysler Freeway. So we made a mural once that actually showed the impact of the Lodge and the Chrysler Freeways on Black and Asian American communities. And then we had a Vincent Chin, you know, and the anniversary of the Vincent Chin incident. We also did an event that linked it to the anniversary of the March Down Woodward, right? That where Martin Luther King first gave his "I Have a Dream" in Detroit speech.
And just for those people who may not know the neighborhood that we're talking about, but who do know where Cinema Detroit is, we're talking just a few blocks south of Cinema Detroit. In fact, the very last scene in the film with Lily Chin asking for justice for Vincent Chin was shot right there in that old Chinatown.
Wow.
You know,
Jasmine, or who wants to go? Yep.
Oh,
Doesn't matter.
Well, I'll just go off Lily Chin. I'll speak very quickly. I just wanted to say that when this movie was made, this happened this documentary was made just soon after the trial and the killing. My book takes place almost 40 years later. And I just wanted to say pretty much everybody I talked to cried. And they acted as if Vincent had just been killed the other day. And it horrified me because it made me realize they're not remembering what happened. They are reliving it. This trauma happened when they were the OG millennials. They're baby boomers now. This is a traumatic, profoundly traumatic effect on their lives. It has haunted them for decades. But what makes it just even more painful for me is to know that they didn't even count in the discussion and discourse on racism. On top of it, they were told, you don't count when this is not a hate crime. This is not racism. You don't count. So when I watched Atlanta, all I could think was when he said, he had a bad day and this is not a crime this is not a hate crime. All I could think was now these people, these loved ones of the Atlanta 8 are going to have to live 40 years from now, crying like it happened yesterday and knowing that they don't count. And that's what I think we're all trying to do as activists, as scholars and professors and filmmakers and storytellers. We need to tell people that we matter, but we also count.
I'm just going to jump on that and say that is so powerful. And I want to uplift the work of many of the organizations that are doing this work, right? So, for example, Over the Moon, recently Rising Voices has begun an educational video series that we are producing. And we're doing this to target the Michigan Asian American community. It's going to be done in many different languages. It's designed for the youth to learn civic engagement and also bring their families into it. And recently we shot a trailer for it, and Esther and people at Over and they did a beautiful job doing a presentation on the street for us. And I have to say, after that shoot, a lot of the other Asian Americans who had joined that project wept. And that is because they had never experienced a scene where they were walking down. This was shot at the East Park.
Yeah.
Where there was like a huge group of young Asian Americans who were there together to do the work. And so I would say, in terms of what can we do to make things move forward, keep moving forward. So it's interesting watching like the Vincent Chin documentary and seeing how that galvanized the Asian American community. Those are our ancestors. We are a new generation right now. We are much more vocal and more demanding. And I think that's something that is beautiful to witness in terms of the people asserting their presence, humanizing the population in a way that is continually pushed back against. And so I think, that's my hope and optimism is coming from all the people who are doing this and the groups like Over the Moon and the books that are coming out, like the one from Paula, where it's inevitable. This wave of activism, this movement, it's going to keep on moving. But
it's good to hear.
Go out there and find your people, because
right.
It's hard. But
exactly,
and find Over the Moon. Find all the organizations that you can work with and for.
Just to just to add to Jasmine, because I think she pretty much summed up what I was thinking, is someone asked me, they sent me a DM and they go, we really love the, the Stop the Anti-Hate protests. And they go, I was always told to be quiet. He's like, my parents always told me to be quiet and just do, just work hard and then you'll succeed, right? We were all told that when we were young. Well, we do that, but we still get hated. We still get bullied. We don't necessarily, that's not a guarantee for success. And I basically said, you have to be loud. Like, it's hard to be loud, but you have to be loud. You have to put yourself out there. And like Jasmine said, find your people, because, even though like I was telling her, Over the Moon, I had a really hard time finding Asians. Like in Detroit, I really had a hard time like trying to get some people together. But when we did get whoever we got, people were like, you know what, I'm going to tell this person. And then it just builds. And I think that we need to show people that we not only matter, but that we're here. We belong here and we're a part of America. We are American. I mean, sure, our ethnicity and culture might be, East Asian, whatever, but we're American, and everything that we were taught is the same as whether you're white, Black, or anybody. We belong here, and we shouldn't feel ashamed, and we should be proud of who we are. So I think like what's wonderful about this discussion, and thank you for having me, is that you see not only people where we learn our history, because we realize that how we don't have our own history told in America as we should. And I hope that we can change that and have more universities and public schools teaching this as a prerequisite to everybody. And then also to demystify us, whether it be our food, our culture, everything. It should be, as like you say, as normal as, like they say, apple pie. It's like if you eat dim sum, that's normal, right? So that's what our goal at Over the Moon is because we're creatives, we really focus more on visuals, because I think that has more power for the young people. And that's what we're working towards, because we want to, like Paula and Jasmine and Scott and Jasmine were saying, we want to show that we belong here and we're not going anywhere. So that's it.
I think that is it. Like,
yeah.
We just had a comment. Dave Kim said, you got to be loud. Just
yes.
Like, you got to be loud.
Got to be loud.
I think that's where we should leave this discussion. I'm really, really thankful to all of you. Much gratitude for being here and sharing your time and talents. I'm really grateful to you all. And I think this was a really great discussion. I hope you feel that way too. Thank you so much. And for ticket holders with questions regarding the issues with the film, you can email Freep Film Festival, all one word, at freepress.com for any issues you may have had with the film. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, audience.
Thank you. An honor.